In Aimee Bender's The Butterfly Lampshade, 8-year-old Francie lives with her single mother who is mentally ill. On the night her mother has a particularly dramatic psychotic break, Francie is set upon a long journey of a kind of self-preservation that we come to understand only as she confronts disturbing and confounding events. She believes that a butterfly has emerged from a butterfly lampshade. A beetle from a kid's drawing emerges in three-dimensional real life, and roses from the pattern on a curtain can be picked up. 20 years later, Francie is still trying to make sense of these incidents. Do they portend her own kind of break with reality and descent into mental illness? Do they make up part of her coping, or do they mean something else? This is Book Public from Texas Public Radio. I'm Yvette Benavides. We spoke to author Aimee Bender about her latest novel, The Butterfly Lampshade. Give us a synopsis of the novel, just for folks who have not read it yet.
Sure. I guess what I would say is that the book is about a young woman, Francie, who is about 27, 28-ish, and she's reconsidering a moment in her life, a kind of major transition, where her mom had a psychotic episode and she went to live with her aunt and ended up staying with her aunt. So there was this time in her life, and she and her mother have a closeness, but it's also just a very complex situation. And she goes to live with her aunt, uncle, and cousin. And she just decides at this moment to kind of take stock of that experience. So it's kind of a sort of deep dive back into a particular transition. And in some ways, I feel like the book is about a kind of close study of transition, because she's really something big changed in her life. And there are these strange incidences that happened at that time, some kind of supernatural moments. And there's also just the dislocated feeling of not quite knowing where your home is. Mm-hmm. And all these things are kind of under a microscope as she reconsiders this moment in her life.
Yeah, the idea of transitions is such an important one here, but there's also there's this blurred line between fantasy and reality. That it's something that's so much a part of our childhood, where adults are really pushing us sometimes toward fantasy and fantastical elements that blur that line, and then just as abruptly life, or even our parents, push us back toward reality. And this is something that happens to Francie. I mean, even as she and her mother Elaine watch Toy Story 2, and sort of share in that, in those elements of, walking, talking toys, then Francie has to manage this idea of life and death with her mother, who has had this psychotic episode, and and everything that comes with that.
Yes, exactly. And I think there were these sort of points on a graph, I guess, that interested me to gather all together inside one book. The graph, gathering a graph somehow, like that there would be exactly what you're saying about childhood, where the lines between fantasy and reality are porous in a very wonderful, beautiful way, and children are kind of geniuses at moving between the imaginative play world and reality. And then there's Francie's mom, who actually does suffer from these episodes where her sense of reality does get genuinely skewed, and it causes her a lot of distress. And so that being a totally other way of these blurs happening. And then for Francie, who has kind of some dark thoughts, there also being a kind of blur between when are the thoughts going to be dangerous, and when is she actually a threat to her mother or anyone else, and when are they just thoughts, and when is that okay. And then the final point on the graph is just, what are these moments of uncanniness that we encounter in our lives that we can't explain, that And then what happens? I guess, this is part of my own writing process, is like, what happens if I throw all these things together in a book and have them bump up against each other?
Well, it worked.
I'm glad to hear it.
Of the uncanny and the expectation of treating her like a little girl with her stuffed animals, including the I love this negligible brown bunny, uh, to use your words, and the idea that her innocence is so corrupted. I mean, she's 8 years
Mhm.
old, and it just happens as a matter of fact of her life and the people that are in her life. I mean, even the discussion of the fontanelle on baby Vicky's head
Yeah.
is a power of suggestion that
Yeah.
stays with her for years and years. I mean, all the way into adulthood, they're still sort of haunted by this idea from childhood.
Exactly. And actually, when you say that too, it makes me think of, although the fontanelle is in the book is kind of this vulnerability of, anyone who's held a baby, it's so scary, right? You see
Yeah.
the little heartbeat through the scalp of the baby. It's so vulnerable. But at the same time, when you say it, it reminds me too that it also is this another blurred line between sort of mind and the world, that you
Yeah.
have the brain sort of slightly exposed. Um, but yes, that these suggestions are so potent to her that she can't shake them, and her own sometimes would think about the relationship between the mother and the daughter in this book as also, the mother is just also very vulnerable to suggestion, and that Francie, the daughter, is overly powerful. But, she can freak out her mother very easily. And what is that dynamic about? What does that look like for both of them over time?
Yeah, and I'm thinking about that scene where Francie has to manage somehow this idea about the grandmother
Mm.
sending her OBGYN a bottle of poison every year and sort of blaming him for the problems with her own daughter. I mean, it's really a lot for Francie to absorb, to see the way that the adults in her life are managing the terrible things that happen in lives, right? There was something about that scene with the grandmother and the poison, and
Mm.
then the way that Francie pushes back on the attitudes that sort of emerge that they have about her poor mother, as if she's ruined everybody's life. And of course, that's not true. That was also something that I thought the transition between a child's sort of fantasy world and the reality that they sort of have to just own up to and live in, but then also the terrible things that maybe are imposed on a child, that and it's really too bad that it happens that way.
Right. And that I often think that kids are the ones that are soaking up so much, but they're also putting a kind of honest mirror to what's in front of them. And that in this scene with the grandmother that you're talking about, the grandmother sort of almost like jokingly sends the doctor this bottle of poison because she's enraged because the doctor made an error. And like you say, she's sort of holding him wrongly accountable. But that also the cruelty and sort of aggression behind that act is not acknowledged by anyone but Francie. And I think kids are often the ones that can sort of see that, and that the adults do get into kind of a behavioral pattern and without seeing what that actually is made of. And I mean, that's part of the reason why I like writing about children, is I feel like they are very sensitive and astute beings in the world.
Yeah, I started to look at Francie in this way of, is she an empath, or is she just very sensitive the way that we all are zeroing in on dust motes and the
Right.
and slants of light and being consumed by those sorts of things, or is there a little bit more going on? And I feel like she's worried about her mom, but also that she's somehow decided in a way that she's so susceptible to having the same issues.
Yeah.
And that's almost, I feel like it's scarier for her than some of these other supernatural things that are happening that she's sort of looking for explanations for just on her own. It's just somehow easier to bear than this idea that she's going to end up like her mom.
Yeah, I think that's true, actually, that the supernatural events are sort of curious, but they're not maybe frightening to her in the same way as, the meaning of her own thoughts, or the worry in everyone, I think, in the family, and just even in the mom herself, who actually is doing okay by the end of the book and has figured out a way to make things work for herself, um, which was important to me to show that she's also kind of finding her own road, but that still there's this kind of anxiety in the family, and that of what's genetic, what gets passed along, what is unknown, what behavior is okay, what behavior is a signal of something else, and how everything gets just charged and loaded with that, looked at a little more closely, so that Francie's has her concerns, her aunt who she goes to live with has her concern. There's concerns. There's a very brief chapter in the book about her cousin having to go to the dentist because she has a certain kind of filling, and there was a point when they wondered if fillings would connect to radio, or something like that. The metal fillings would have a way to connect to. This is a true thing. Like I don't remember the science exactly, but that you would actually hear voices in your fillings, and that there was a terror on the part of the aunt that if her child starts to hear voices because it's related to her cavity, she wants to be really clear that if there's any mental illness, that it's not coming from her teeth. So they go and they all get their cavities changed to composite. But there's, I guess, what I'm hoping to convey in that is the level of sort of worry and vigilance in the family.
So, one of the many things I appreciate about the novel is like the structure of it is, I don't know if recursive is the right word. It's sort of like the way things are set up for the 8-year-old, from the 8-year-old's point of view. And we learn some things from an 8-year-old's point of view. And then she's in her 20s, and it's sort of like this, the same situations are being relived, or she's thinking about them. You zoom in, you zoom out, and it's a very interesting structure. And I kept thinking about it as realistic. It's sort of like, it is like when Francie is 8, we're 8, and we sort of take in her world that way. And then when she's in her 20s and she's describing something, it is sort of that, certain things come in more lucidly or vividly or pointedly, and certain things fall away. I found that so interesting, that recursiveness of the structure of, there was a certain pattern of that I really appreciated. I could really sort of see Francie as not two characters, but exactly that, like this point of view had morphed. And this is the way I think adults really experience the world and memory.
Yeah. Oh, I'm so glad. I mean, it's really nice to hear that, because it's, I feel like I'll kind of try to lean into what the book, where the writing is sort of naturally flowing. And there was this, I mean, I think recursive makes sense. There was this kind of quality of revisiting and circling, but it always felt I would be able to feel engaged with it, which is like my only guide as a writer, is just to follow where the work feels engaging to me, even if it's straying from any, and often it is straying from any plan. My planning is just generally doesn't work. So instead, it being this kind of looking and re-looking and looking again and looking deeper and finding a new thing. And when in memory do we have a picture in our minds, and then something widens and we see something that we didn't see before, and how does that change our sense of things? I was just reading, Public Space has been doing these book groups all year online during the pandemic, and I had the pleasure of leading a beautiful novel by William Maxwell called So Long, See You Tomorrow, and it's also about memory and about grief. But there's a memory that the author talks about in like the second chapter and revisits at the end, and it's just slightly different at the end, but it's a kind of major change. But I've read the book many times, and only this time did I really take in this change, which I feel like I won't say concretely in case someone feels like reading it.
It's a great
But
novel.
it does feel accurate, I think, to my experience of memory too, which is like things get filled in, and we see a different perspective, and so that kind of revisiting felt important ultimately to this book.
I like the idea of the tent. So there's this thing that Francie's mother does. She sets up these tape recorders in different rooms of their apartment, and she sort of tents paper over the recorders as if she's hiding them, and then will put her hand under the tent to turn it on or off, or turn the tape over. And then there's this tent. There's a real tent on a balcony.
Yeah, exactly.
A memory and I just, even those kinds of echoes, even if they're not deliberate, they're not deliberate, you pick up on them or you don't as a reader. There was just this extra thing there about childhood and tents, and forts and living room forts and tents, and the way that Francie returns to that in her 20s with Vicky, on the balcony of her own apartment all these years later, that I just loved. And it was sort of this very quiet, isolated bubble that she could enter, really believing that that was going to be the way that she could zero in on some of these memories.
There's a bit of even a kind of magical quality in that idea that like we can sit and the memories can sort of come up, but they sort of do for her. And it has like it's like a talisman in a way. And you're right. I mean, that it was not a deliberate connection to have the little tents over the tape recorders and to have her then enter a tent. But there was one point late in my own sort of rereadings of the drafts that I saw that too and was surprised. And, the writing process is so interesting.
Oh, yeah.
Mysterious in so many ways. But that ultimately there is a parallel. There were recordings of what was happening, and she is kind of trying to create some sort of internal document of a time that was such a blur. I think that was the other sort of project of it for her and for me, was to think of how in childhood things, they move emotionally and they move, I think, texturally and viscerally, but they're not articulated in a certain way. And that, in my mind, part of processing or part of adulthood is then what happens when those things solidify a little bit and become more real to you and more known. Mm-hmm. And how do you take it from there?
I like the way the idea of this sort of olfactory, I don't know if it's a hallucination, this olfactory hallucination that comes up with the whiff of newsprint as the, quote, precise smell of dislocation for her. And it's something that she comes to, 30 or 40 pages from the end of the novel. And so much has happened, so much has gone on the train and in her life. And of course, the idea of smell and taste being so close to those, those Proustian ideas of memory. And I found that so interesting too, because it came later, and I felt like she was making sense of that part of her life, this sort of sensory imagery connection in the way that smells affect us, smells from childhood, and that it was that of all things, right? Like the newsprint of these search a word books that she had to do. And I was thinking also about the train and her idea of rejecting going on an airplane to California because she didn't want to see the blurred landscape out the window, which we know she wouldn't have seen it that way. and she prefers the train, which in my mind is the view out the window of the train is a lot more blurry
Right.
in the air. And I just felt like, these ideas that she has, that then she has to just on her own come to the discovery and the getting over it. And I loved seeing her, for instance, not to give too much away, but at a certain point in the novel, on a plane, right? I love this idea of the way that she by herself overcomes these great big fears in her life, just on her own.
Mm. Yeah. And I love what you said too about the smell and the taste and yeah, how Proust gave us that sense of, or the reminder that it's such an access point to memory. And yeah, I guess it's true. It's that she finally does, when she's on a plane, just that the reality of a plane that people had insisted to her was not blurry like she imagined, but the terror of it was so real.
Yeah.
The blur and her life being so constant that any risk of amplifying it wasn't worth it until later. And then it was okay. And so, yeah.
Yeah.
And I guess, right, that's just of interest to me too. It's like, at what point can something get looked at, and what's the factor of time in that too? A certain amount of time and something becomes look atable sometimes.
Yeah, even in thinking about the freeze tag game, she's, everyone else is all a blur running all around her, and she's the one that decides that she's going to be frozen. She's going to be, and that's the way that she's at that point, and really throughout, just her sense of being is she's so watchful, and she's so still, and yet all of these things are happening in her mind. So it's like this crazy freeze tag that's going on. So I really just appreciate all this with motion and flying and the train. Tell me about.
Yeah, it's such a pleasure to hear your thoughts.
Oh no, I love this book. Shrina is someone to whom Francie continually refers to as the babysitter for a good chunk of the novel. And she calls Stan's relative, who shepherds her from Portland to Burbank, the steward. And these are people that are really important for this journey that she's on. And she doesn't really say their names too much. I kept noticing this. It felt like she was doing a little bit of wall building, locking that door as she's wont to do. And I found it so interesting. There was a lot of goodwill extended to her in her childhood. There's a lot of love and there's a lot of goodwill that so many people around her, even her friend's mom, with the booster seat in the car and all of this. And I just, that's another thing that I was really struck by, these people in our childhood, that this is very realistic. These people in our childhoods that are, part of this village, and they all know her story. Unfortunately, it's a sad story. These were not empty moments, as we learn. They're moments that are just so loaded with meaning that Francie remembers. It seems like every second of it, the fringy scarf and Hattie the cat, and
Well, and maybe in that way too, which I think is it's at least true for me. If I think of, times that are more intense, are more kind of locked down in terms of detail of memory than the sort of easy flowy times, which kind of have a more like general quality than, so something has to be heightened in some way, and then the memories click in more clearly. But yeah, I was aware that, like, I wanted the adults to sort of step up for her, and I wanted there to be sort of a kindness. Of course, there doesn't have to be in the situation. It could have happened very differently, but that the focus for me was on a very internal shift in the character, and that the conflict and the worry wasn't about threats from other people, but was just about her own worry about herself. And
Yeah.
so I wanted the other people to be, to really, to be able to, and like you say, to have their own perception of her struggle. And I'm imagining her going through this transition fairly checked out, so not being able to absorb the kindness directly, but to be absorbing it 20 years later, to like be taking in,
Uh-huh.
oh, what did this person do? And in that way, I think you're right about the lack of naming, that she knows Shrina's name, but Shrina's also kind of this role. She's playing a role, and there's something solid about calling her the babysitter. Like she knows exactly where she fits.
Mm-hmm.
And the steward, whose name turns out to maybe have possibly been Stewart, but it's unclear, like he's, but that, so that they fit sort of like a tale, and then they maybe start to become a little bit, hopefully, more real. And there's contact made in a different way later in the book, and that sort of there's the kind of story of childhood and the characters and the roles they play, and then there's the breaking apart of that story and reaching out to people as an adult and seeing what they're actually like and connecting in a different way, and that changes the memories, of course.
Mm-hmm.
um,
And
yeah.
these are not imposing figures. Like they didn't want to, like, I don't know, adopt her or keep her,
Right.
or and with Shrina, it was this little loft area, and seeing the cat coming down and the dish drain, and sort of like these things that were, and I think you use this word in the book, the things that were sort of anchoring her to the space, because
Yes.
she really, really needed that. And so it seemed like these were the opportunities for those things, for the steward to, stand in front of the, in between Francie and other people, who had come up to her, and just those sorts of things that they were protecting her, I guess, but it was more like they represented a kind of of an anchoring in whatever space she happened to be in. I felt like that was really a neat thing to come across in the novel.
Oh, I'm glad. And I think it's absolutely right. And it goes back to the freeze tag that you were talking about earlier, where she, as a character, like as she became clear to me on the page as a character, this moment of other kids running around a playground and playing games and throwing their bodies around, and Francie staying very still as a way to take stock of herself and to know she's there. That in the same way, to be looking around at this apartment of the babysitter, and to find such grounding in the different objects, and similarly, to be noticing exactly what the steward is doing on the train, like that these observations serve a very, like a very important purpose to her, that the heightened observations feel like they are placing her in a world, that something in her at any moment feels like it could slip away. And so there's kind of and in the act of going over the memories is an act then of I almost sometimes felt like it was her putting herself into the past where she had not fully existed for herself, even though it had happened, but she was sort of inserting herself into these events that had happened. And in that way, they become part of her and then can be moved past. But until that happens, they're so fleeting, and she's not quite in them yet.
Mm-hmm. I haven't talked about the butterfly and the beetle and the rose. And it's not for any other reason except there's just so much to talk about, even though these are some really important elements of the novel. So they are these things that seem to be sort of inanimate in a space, like the lampshade or a drawing or curtains, and then suddenly these objects are there. There's so much here that's just enigmatic and mysterious and surreal.
Mm-hmm.
In the next beat, I'm thinking, Yeah, like people. What's more enigmatic and mysterious and surreal than, all of us walking around right now? And
Right.
I
I mean,
kept sort of
yeah.
looking at this idea of what these objects. I feel sometimes like there are readers out there who sort of offhandedly reject surreal elements in literary fiction, or they sort of dance around them, or they ignore them, or
Right.
and that's just, that doesn't work. But I also feel like it would be okay if your reader doesn't fully render some defined meaning, because because neither does the character. I mean, it's just
Right.
the mysteries of life. I'm just thinking about how magical this is and how necessary, and then I'm drawn back to the idea of, oh, how real those things are,
Mm.
for an 8-year-old, or for somebody who's thinking back to that and has never resolved the issue, even at 27 or 28.
Yeah. I mean, it's actually quite beautiful to hear you say it that way, because I think, yes, I feel like the thing that I'll trust about an image is just if it feels right on the page, and if I can sort of bear to reread it is my gauge. That when I'm looking back over pages I've written, it shows very quickly what things have no charge to them. I think George Saunders says charge or juice. I can't remember his word for it, but just that images, lines, words sort of come packed or not packed. And if they're not packed, they fall away. And I could feel that the butterfly and the beetle and the rose had this sort of resonance, but the meaning is less important to me, actually. Like what I'm hoping that the reader will be interested in sort of dwelling with me and with Francie with these images, these traversing, these objects that move from two-dimensionality in the world of objects into the world of life, but are dead. And in these realms that Francie is moving between, and that her mom is moving between, and in this kind of blurry line between fantasy and reality, that there are some concrete examples, and that they are ultimately not going to be fully explainable, and that's important to me. Like I don't want to create an equation where a reader is like, aha, I will now check off the meaning box, because it's so much. I just want it to have to create some feeling, whatever that is, some experiential feeling. And that, I guess my hope is then to say, if someone feels worried they're not getting it, or that there's something to get, to instead redirect and say, what does it make you think about? What did it make you feel? What might be a moment from your life where you felt something sort of traverse a boundary that didn't feel traversable? And what was that? And what is Francie sort of trying to sort through?
Aimee Bender, thank you so much for talking to me. I so appreciate it.
Oh, Yvette, what a true pleasure to talk to you. I really appreciate your close reading so much.
Aimee Bender is the author of The Butterfly Lampshade. This has been Book Public on Texas Public Radio. Write to us at bookpublic@tpr.org. Jacob Rosati composed our theme music. Bree Kirkham is our digital producer. Dan Katz is Texas Public Radio's news director. I'm Yvette Benavides.